In the early hours of September 3rd, 1998, the coal town of Grafton, Pennsylvania, woke to a sound that didn't quite register at first. Some said it felt like a low, distant thunder. Others said it was more like a slow-motion groan from deep inside the earth. It came just before dawn. By 6:14 a.m., sirens were already echoing down the main street as local emergency crews raced toward the old Carter Ridge mining complex, where a section of Tunnel B had just collapsed without warning, trapping 12 men nearly 600 feet underground. The initial assumption was that the collapse was partial, that maybe the support columns had buckled under years of vibration, or that a pocket of methane had triggered a minor cave-in. Most of the town had relatives or friends in that mine. They'd seen cave-ins before. It was dangerous work, but accidents were part of the job. Usually, you waited a day or two. The crew dug, the radios crackled, and eventually someone crawled out bloodied but breathing. But this time, no one came up. Not a single voice over the line, not even static. By noon, a staging area had been set up at the North Access Road, and a rescue task force was flown in from Harrisburg. Drilling rigs and ventilation units arrived by flatbed. Grafton High suspended classes. The town's only diner stayed open 24/7, serving free coffee to rescue workers. A line of wives, sisters, and sons waited behind the makeshift fence line, clutching photos, lunch pails, and hope. On the first night, candles lined the highway guardrails like a flickering trail leading toward the dark. Rescue teams made contact with the upper shafts by day 2, but no tapping or movement was heard from below. They dropped sensors into the void, hoping to detect vibrations, anything that could indicate life. All they got was silence. Tunnels that should have been mapped were suddenly inaccessible. Diagrams didn't match the terrain. It was as if part of the mine had never existed on record at all. And that was when the older miners started talking. Not on the record, not to the press, but in quiet conversations, huddled around tailgates and fire barrels. They mentioned something they called the drift. Drift 7, unofficially. It wasn't on the Carter Ridge blueprints. It was rumored to have been dug decades earlier and then abandoned after a fatal rock burst in the 1930s. Old-timers swore it was cursed ground. Some said there were things buried back there that had nothing to do with coal. Most thought it was just folklore. But others remembered whispers from management, never go past the 8th marker, never enter Drift 7. That was where the rock groaned, even when no one was working. On day 5, a temporary moratorium was placed on all rescue efforts due to fears of secondary collapse. Families protested, and television vans began lining the streets. Carter Ridge Mining issued a vague press release blaming unstable shale formations and outdated load supports. But those closest to the case noticed something else. No executive from the company ever showed their face at the site, not once. The fences went up almost immediately after, even before the rescue was officially declared over. By day 10, the state declared all 12 men deceased. No bodies were ever recovered. The official record lists it as a catastrophic structural failure, but among the families, it never felt like an accident. 12 men gone, no remains, no gear, no trace. Just a sealed mouth in the earth where a tunnel used to be. The mine was closed permanently, and a chain-link fence erected around the entire complex. Trespassing signs were hammered into the ground overnight. Within weeks, the town moved on, at least on the surface. But the scars lingered in quiet ways. Christmas cards addressed to the dead sat year after year on mantelpieces. Widow support groups met in the basement of St. Agnes every Thursday. Children who lost their fathers stopped visiting the edge of the woods near the site, saying the ground made strange sounds when it rained. Most people chalked it up to trauma, nothing more. But not everyone accepted the story as it was told. One of the victims' brothers, a former miner named Hank Corbett, kept files, clippings, maps. He said the collapse wasn't natural, that there had been pressure to dig deeper, faster, even when sensors showed instability. That Carter Ridge knew about the drift and chose to ignore the risks. He claimed they'd sealed something off, something they didn't want found. For 25 years, he pressed for answers. He got none. Years passed. The town shrank, Shops closed, the diner reduced its hours, the Carter Ridge site became overgrown, its fence sagging and rusted. Teenagers dared each other to sneak under the gate, but most turned back before reaching the ruins. A few graffiti tags appeared on the outer wall, dates, initials, sometimes the number 12. A local pastor left a cross and a laminated list of names just beyond the gate. No one removed it. By 2023, most of the country had forgotten the Grafton collapse entirely. It wasn't the worst mining disaster in American history. It wasn't even the worst in Pennsylvania, just another small-town tragedy with no ending. But for the families, it never stopped being current. They didn't just lose husbands and fathers. They lost graves, closure, truth. And though most stopped talking about it, they never stopped wondering what really happened down there, in the dark, after the radios went quiet. And then, 25 years later, sounds began again from beneath the earth. By 2023, Grafton looked less like a town and more like a memory. Fewer than 600 people remained, and nearly half the homes stood boarded up or overgrown. Main Street storefronts, once busy with barbers, butchers, and corner grocers, were now dusted over with sun-faded "for lease" signs. Time hadn't just passed here. It had stopped. And at the edge of town, where the pines thickened and the dirt road turned to gravel, the rusted gates of Carter Ridge Mine still held their vigil, untouched and unchanged, like they were waiting for something. 25 years had passed since the collapse, and yet, every September 3rd, without fail, the families still came. Some wore the same denim jackets they'd worn in '98. Some brought folding chairs and coolers and sat in silence. Others simply parked their trucks by the chain-link fence, left a candle burning on the hood, and waited until nightfall before driving back into town. No one ever said much. They didn't have to. Everyone who still showed up knew someone who never came out. There was no official monument, just a handmade wooden plaque near the gate with 12 names carved by hand, the edges slowly wearing away with each season. Locals had tried to raise funds for a proper memorial a few years back, but the county office stopped replying after the third email. When the mine closed, it took more than jobs. It took something intangible, momentum, purpose, connection. The collapse didn't just bury 12 miners, it buried the future of an entire place. Kids who'd been 5 or 6 when the collapse happened were now in their 30s. Some had left, some came back, but most kept a cautious distance from anything related to Carter Ridge. There were stories you didn't ask about, not unless you wanted silence in return. Still, once in a while, people talked. Over a beer, at a funeral, in the aisles of the hardware store. A former dispatcher remembered something strange about the 9th day of the rescue, said she heard rhythmic tapping coming through the auxiliary headset, clear, steady knocks. When she tried to play the recording back, the tape was blank. A retired firefighter remembered the same day, said one of the dogs brought in from Pittsburgh froze near the shaft and wouldn't move forward, just whimpered until it was carried out. Another rescue worker swore he heard a voice, low, distorted, calling a name he didn't recognize. When he reported it, they told him it was echo from the machinery. But the most disturbing account came from a man named Richard Hayes, who had worked maintenance on the eastern vent tower. He said on day 9, just before midnight, he heard what sounded like singing. Not loud, not clear, but layered, like multiple voices coming from deep below. When he climbed down to investigate, the sound stopped, and by the time he got back up, the air felt colder than it should have been. He never told his supervisor, only his wife, and after that night, he never set foot on mine property again. For the families, these stories weren't proof of anything, but they weren't nothing either. They filled a space left behind by unanswered questions, small pieces of a puzzle that no one was supposed to finish. The company's official report stated the collapse had been sudden and final. Zero survivability event. But there were too many details that didn't fit. Rescue blueprints that didn't match the terrain, geological scans that showed sealed voids in areas labeled as solid rock. And then there was the drift, the forbidden corridor whispered about by the old-timers, conveniently omitted from every map released to the public. Younger generations heard about the mine like it was folklore, a spooky story told around bonfires or passed around in group chats when someone dared them to walk up to the fence at night. Kids said you could still hear the metal creak when the wind blew just right, that if you pressed your ear to the fence long enough, you'd hear someone breathing on the other side. Just myths, most people thought. But even the teenagers never stayed long. Over time, Grafton became a place people drove through, not to. A town where the gas station still sold VHS tapes, where the phone booth still worked, and where the local radio station still played the same jazz hour every Friday night. It was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if the land itself had chosen to go still. And yet, something persisted just beneath the silence. The mine never flooded, never caved in further. The chain-link fence never fell, despite years of storms and neglect. The warning signs, sun-bleached and dented, never blew away. It was as if the site was being preserved, protected, even watched. There were no patrols, but no one ever crossed the boundary. Not really, not alone, not sober. Those who lived through the collapse carried it with them, tucked into their bones, buried in the unspoken rituals of daily life. They knew how to sense when someone was about to bring it up, and how to steer the conversation away before it reached the edge. And yet, beneath all that caution, was a shared, lingering tension, the fear that maybe somehow it hadn't really ended, that whatever had gone wrong in that mine wasn't fully buried. And in the fall of that 25th year, as the air turned colder and the leaves began to drop, a crew working less than a mile away from the gate, digging for a new utility line, reported something strange. It started as a vibration, then a knocking, then a voice. In late October of 2023, a two-man crew from Keystone Infrastructure arrived on the outskirts of Grafton to begin preliminary work for a fiber optic line running parallel to the old Carter Ridge access road. The job was simple, standard directional drilling to lay conduit below the frost line. The site had been flagged and cleared by the county with only one notable restriction: do not disturb the mine perimeter. The old fence was still standing, though rusted and leaning in spots, and the woods had begun to reclaim the area. By then, most workers didn't know the full history of what lay beneath. It was just another patch of dead land. The first strange report came on the second day of drilling. A junior operator named Miguel Correa stopped the bore when he felt what he described as a slow pulse reverberating through the soil. He thought they'd hit an old sewer line or a hollow pocket of limestone, but when he pulled back the drill and reinserted the ground microphone, a routine check, the line picked up a soft, rhythmic thump. It repeated every 6 to 7 seconds. Then silence. Then again. They ran diagnostics, switched out the sensors, and moved 20 feet to the east. Same result. The crew leader brushed it off as geological feedback. The area was full of fractured rock layers and moisture pockets. Echoes weren't unusual. But that night, Miguel couldn't shake the sound. He played it back through his phone, listening in bed. And that's when he heard something else layered beneath it. A sound that hadn't been audible at the site, something that resembled a voice trying to speak, but smothered by earth. The next morning, he brought it to the foreman, a man named Craig Donovan, who'd worked projects from Pittsburgh to Punxsutawney for over 20 years. Craig didn't believe in ghosts, didn't believe in much at all, but when he listened through the noise-canceling headphones in the truck, his hands stiffened. The voice wasn't clear, it wasn't even complete, but it was human, and it was close. That same day, Craig stood behind the rig operator and made a short recording with his phone while the equipment was powered off. In the 28-second clip, there are 3 audible knocks, then a faint sound like a whisper pressed through gravel. He uploaded the audio to a Facebook community group that night under the caption, "What is this? Carter Ridge site, recorded today." He tagged it as a curiosity, nothing more. By sunrise, the video had over 3,000 views. By noon, it had been downloaded, re-uploaded, and dissected across Reddit and TikTok by self-proclaimed paranormal investigators. But back in Grafton, the reactions were quieter, more haunted. People who'd lived through the 1998 collapse listened with a different kind of fear. Not theatrical, not fascinated, just shaken. One woman, Joanne Westfield, whose brother had been among the 12 lost, recognized something deeper than just a noise. She said the rhythm matched the tapping patterns they'd used in the mines to signal location or distress. One long knock, too short. It meant, "I'm here." She hadn't heard that code in over 2 decades, but she remembered it instantly. Within 48 hours, the Grafton Sheriff's Office was contacted by both local officials and a regional rep from the Department of Environmental Protection. The sound was potentially geological, yes, but also possibly evidence of unsealed voids under public land. And the fact that it was coming from near the old Drift 7 junction, the very stretch long rumored to have been sealed improperly, made the matter impossible to ignore. On November 1st, 2023, Sheriff Mark Ellery formally reopened the Carter Ridge site for investigation, the first sanctioned entry since the rescue was called off 25 years earlier. It was a quiet move, no press release, no major media alert, just a temporary work permit, a perimeter expansion, and an equipment drop scheduled for the following Monday. But word got out. Within days, cars began appearing again at the edge of the mine gate. Not journalists, locals, people who hadn't driven that road in years. Some brought folding chairs, some brought candles. Others stood behind the chain-link fence with arms crossed, listening. They didn't need scientific proof. They knew what it meant. Something was waking up. As drilling resumed near the sound point, new anomalies emerged. Ground-penetrating radar showed irregular voids beneath the soil, voids not present in the original 1998 collapse reports. Even more unusual, the readings changed slightly each time they scanned, as if something in the rock itself was shifting. Pressure changes were logged, ambient temperature drops recorded. Engineers blamed faulty sensors. But after the third equipment failure in 2 days, even they began to fall quiet. That week, a former mine inspector named Curtis Redd came forward after seeing the story online. Now in his 70s, Curtis had been one of the first to arrive after the 1998 incident. He admitted he'd always questioned the final report, but never spoke publicly out of fear of litigation. He recalled something that had stuck with him for years. On day 9 of the original rescue attempt, one of the listening devices had picked up what sounded like metal on metal clinking, followed by a single word, muffled, but clear. A name. He wouldn't say what it was, only that when he heard the new audio clip from the drill site, it sounded exactly the same. The reopening of the Carter Ridge site didn't just stir up dust, it stirred up memory. And not the comforting kind. This wasn't a place where time had healed, it was a place where time had frozen, where questions had been sealed in stone. And now, for the first time in 25 years, the stone was answering back. 2 weeks after the Carter Ridge site was officially reopened, a forensic investigation team arrived from the State Geological Bureau, 2 engineers, a mining historian, and a structural safety advisor who had worked on 3 prior collapse reconstructions across Appalachia. Their job was simple on paper: assess the integrity of the remaining tunnel structure, determine whether any subsurface activity, natural or artificial, could be responsible for the strange sounds, and advise whether drilling near the old mine should continue or be halted indefinitely. But almost immediately, the team hit inconsistencies buried in the foundation of the case itself. The first red flag came during a re-evaluation of the 1998 collapse diagrams. The team had requested copies of the original blueprints and rescue tunnel overlay. The files sent over from the Carter Ridge archives appeared complete until they compared them to modern geological survey maps from the U.S. Geological Service. The tunnel marked as B12 Corridor in the 1998 map was listed as 122 feet long. But the 2023 scans, run with ground-penetrating radar, indicated a shaft at that same position nearly twice that length. What's more, it extended at a downward pitch that wasn't noted in any of the archived documentation. To verify, they used borehole scanners at 5-foot intervals, tracing the full suspected path. The scanners confirmed not only the pitch, but a sudden chamber-like widening at its farthest point, a cavity that measured nearly 14 feet in diameter and extended laterally beyond what should have been bedrock. That section hadn't collapsed, it had been closed. The wall of rubble wasn't uniform like a natural cave-in. It was packed, layered, and curved, almost like it had been intentionally filled from one side. That detail changed everything. The possibility of a deliberately sealed tunnel raised questions that hadn't been asked in over 2 decades, at least not publicly. If a section of the mine had been intentionally walled off before or during the collapse, the next question was why? And more importantly, what had been on the other side? Further examination of site permits from the 90s revealed something else that didn't line up. In the months before the collapse, Carter Ridge had filed 3 separate expansions with the state, one of which included a provisional approval to explore below 600 feet, marked with a temporary classification, conditional vertical access. That term was specific. It meant they were testing the feasibility of deeper extraction, something the mine had never formally been cleared for. The depth in question, just under 670 feet, would have placed workers near the lower boundary of the original 1930s mining level, a site rumored to have been shut down due to structural instability and unexplained gas events. What made this discovery chilling wasn't just the breach of regulations. It was the fact that no such vertical shaft was ever disclosed in the 1998 rescue effort. No diagrams showed an access tunnel to that level. No interviews from the original mine supervisors mentioned a drill down. And yet, the radar scans from 2023 showed a shaft leading straight down, abandoned, narrow, but real. Old-timers in Grafton had spoken of a generation of tunnels that predated even the Carter Ridge operations, dig sites used during the Depression when safety codes were non-existent and record-keeping was nearly as bad. Those tunnels were sealed or collapsed by the mid-40s, but if the 1998 crew had broken into one of those legacy shafts, that could explain why the collapse spread unpredictably and why, even back then, no bodies had ever been recovered. A former rescue coordinator from the original collapse, now retired and living in Erie, agreed to speak anonymously. He remembered being pulled aside by a Carter Ridge executive on day 3 of the rescue and told to avoid the east vector due to gas instability. But that area had tested clean during the first ventilation probe. The coordinator later learned that section included an undocumented spur, one that engineers at the time had been instructed not to access without written clearance. He said it struck him as odd, but not suspicious, until now. The theory forming among the new investigative team was this: the 1998 collapse didn't just trap 12 miners. It may have exposed something the company wanted hidden, an older tunnel system, possibly unsafe, undocumented, and off-permit. If Drift 7 or one of its connecting arms had been breached, it would have created unpredictable airflow, compromised wall pressure, and, in a worst-case scenario, sparked a chain collapse of multiple shafts at once. But rather than admit to illegal drilling or negligence, Carter Ridge may have closed off the affected sections, sealed them in behind false cave-ins, and abandoned all hope of recovery, publicly citing it as a total structural failure. And if any of those deeper sections had remained partially intact, that could explain the sounds. Forensic geologists proposed the possibility of a trapped air chamber, one that had remained undisturbed for over 2 decades. In such conditions, sound can behave erratically. Echoes can be delayed, distorted, even preserved under the right geological pressure. If the men had survived even a few days in that sealed space, if they had knocked, shouted, tapped against the stone, some of those sound waves could have remained suspended in the fractured quartz and shale. As the rock fractured or vibrated due to nearby drilling, those waves might now be escaping. It was a theory, unlikely, but not impossible, and one that suddenly shifted the tone of the investigation from structural to something more personal. If there truly was a chamber, still intact, sealed, and sitting somewhere beneath that sealed corridor, then someone would need to reach it, not to save anyone, but to find out what was left, and whether the voices weren't just memories, but echoes waiting to be heard. On the morning of November 17th, 2023, under a gray sky and light snow, a 4-person entry team began their descent into Carter Ridge's upper access tunnel. They were contracted through a private mine rescue outfit based out of Kentucky, veterans of deep earth response, cave collapses, and post-incident exploration. The lead was a former firefighter and confined space specialist named Wade Mercer. The rest of the crew included a structural analyst, a seismic audio technician, and a tech operator responsible for maneuvering the microcamera and tethered drone system. It wasn't a rescue. Everyone knew that. But it wasn't just a survey either. There was a tone among the crew that none of them said aloud, but all of them understood. They weren't just walking into a collapsed mine. They were walking into a sealed event, one that had been closed up and left untouched for a quarter century. And now, something down there was making noise again. The entry point had been partially reinforced in the days prior, but much of the original tunnel remained intact, cold, narrow, and layered with decades of silt and rust. The walls were streaked with condensation. The air carried a sour weight that coated the tongue. Still, oxygen levels were viable, low but not lethal. They wore personal gas monitors but not full respirators. It was just breathable enough. The first 100 feet were uneventful. Dust, dislodged stone, bits of old electrical conduit, and iron support plates that had turned the color of dried blood. But around the 140-foot mark, the first anomaly appeared. A series of freshly fractured support timbers lying across the path like snapped matchsticks. The break patterns were jagged, sharp, and inconsistent with long-term rot. No one had been down here since 1998. The wood shouldn't look like this. They documented the break points, took air samples, and kept moving. At 170 feet, the seismic technician paused. Her handheld geophone had picked up a pulse, brief, faint, but mechanical in rhythm. It repeated twice, then stopped. When she placed the sensor directly against the tunnel wall, the signal resumed. 5 taps. Pause. 3 more. Pause. Then nothing. It wasn't machinery. There was no machinery. And the pattern repeated with just enough delay that it couldn't be explained as feedback or resonance. The team went still. Wade keyed his mic, but no one spoke. They just stood there in the dark, listening to stone breathe. The deeper they moved, the more erratic the sounds became. Not louder, sharper. Like something tapping from far away, but amplified by the surrounding walls. The geophone struggled to pin down the source. The signal bounced, refracted. But one thing became clear. The sounds were following a directional gradient. They weren't being heard evenly. They were getting closer. At 220 feet, the team reached a structural bulge in the tunnel, a spot previously marked as a total collapse. But this wasn't debris. It was a man-made fill. A packed stone wall reinforced with scrap metal and overlaid with concrete slurry. A hasty plug. Not company-issued, not engineered, just filled. And behind it, the tapping was clearest of all. The microcamera was extended through a shallow fissure between the fill layers. What came back was limited, just 6 feet of view. But what they saw raised more questions than answers. On the other side of the sealed wall was an open space. Not a chamber exactly. More like the start of another tunnel descending at a slight slope. And embedded in the stone just beyond the wall was a helmet, fused to the rock. The old-style kind. White shell, faded sticker. The kind used in Carter Ridge in 1998. The team noted the ED position, ran a second acoustic pass, and confirmed pressure stability. The sealed section appeared to be holding, but the internal temperature was 6 degrees warmer than the rest of the tunnel. The wall was dry, unlike the surrounding area. And most disturbing of all, the tapping resumed while the camera was still extended, this time alongside a brief wheezing hiss. The audio technician reviewed the waveform later that day. The hiss wasn't static. It was breath. Slow, strained, and cut short mid-cycle. She played it for the rest of the team. No one spoke while it ran. When it ended, Wade simply said they were done for the day. The crew exited without incident. No one was hurt. But all of them left with the sense that something had not only been sealed in, but was trying still to come out. The data they brought back triggered a rapid response, not because of fear, because of possibility. Geologists reviewing the footage noted an upward air current coming through the fissure. That suggested an unsealed shaft above the chamber, possibly a breached vent from an older tunnel. If that shaft had stayed open even partially over the years, it could have allowed oxygen exchange and sound migration. The notion wasn't supernatural, it was scientific. Under the right conditions, a sealed tunnel with the right geology could carry a voice, or a memory of one. The timber breaks, the shifting fill, the audio anomalies, everything pointed to activity. Not life, necessarily, but motion, pressure, change. They didn't know what was behind that wall, whether it was just trapped air escaping or something else. But whatever it was, it had waited 25 years in the dark, and now it was speaking again. In the days that followed the descent, the focus of the investigation shifted from the physical space beneath Carter Ridge to something far more elusive: sound. The seismic recordings taken inside the sealed shaft were handed off to a specialized audio analysis lab based out of Penn State. Their team included acoustic engineers, forensic audio technicians, and a consulting linguist with experience in Appalachian dialects. The objective was simple: determine what, if anything, was actually being communicated through the taps and vocalizations. But what they found didn't fit easily into any one explanation. The tapping, once isolated from background frequencies, formed a clear pattern. Spaced at precise intervals, it wasn't random. The engineers broke it down and compared it to standard mining codes used for communication in low visibility or collapsed environments. One of those codes, 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, was a known signal for need help. It had been taught to Carter Ridge miners during safety drills in the early 90s. On the spectrogram, the rhythm repeated 3 times within the same recording. It wasn't caused by shifting rocks or pressure drops. It was structured, intentional. More chilling, however, was the vocal layer. At first, it seemed like static, intermittent and buried deep beneath the resonance of stone. But when boosted and run through spectral denoise software, certain fragments began to emerge, not full sentences, but words. And not just any words, names. The first one clearly captured was Paul. Then, after a stretch of silence, Mick. 2 names. Both men who had been among the 12 lost in the 1998 collapse. The linguist listened to the enhanced audio over 24 times, gradually charting what appeared to be a kind of fragmented roll call. Several instances of first names were repeated with different inflections, some drawn out, others stammered or overlapping. It was disjointed, staggered. At times, more than one voice spoke at once. In the quietest sections, whispers, low, breathless, layered like they were echoing off each other. One segment lasted only 4.8 seconds, but in that window, 3 names were spoken in succession. All matched the company roster from that September shift. It wasn't proof of survival, everyone agreed on that, but it wasn't meaningless either. The timing was too perfect, the location too specific. The fact that the names weren't just random syllables, they were real, connected, and emotionally devastating to the families, pushed the investigation into new territory. It felt like listening to the past knocking from behind a locked door. Local media caught wind of the audio analysis and began publishing excerpts, triggering both fascination and disbelief. Online forums lit up with theories, everything from time-locked echo chambers to trapped spirits. But in Grafton, no one was theorizing. They were remembering. Families of the missing played the audio in their homes, some for hours on loop. For many, it wasn't about science, it was about recognition. One widow, Laura McKinney, said she heard her husband's voice in the final loop. She played it for her daughter, who was 5 when he vanished. The girl, now 30, broke down in silence. It was him, she said, the way he said his name. No one else talked like that. Still, not everyone believed the sounds were voices at all. A group of physicists from Lehigh University published a statement cautioning the public not to jump to conclusions. They proposed an alternate explanation: acoustic entrapment, a rare phenomenon in which sound waves, especially low-frequency human noise, can become refracted, slowed, or distorted in dense geological formations like quartz or layered shale. These waves, under extreme compression, could in theory be held within a rock formation and released over time as fractures or seismic shifts opened the medium. In other words, the voices could be real, but not recent, just sonic memories, replaying themselves as the Earth slowly shifted. The team at Penn State didn't entirely disagree. They acknowledged that some of the spectral signatures showed evidence of phase distortion, consistent with wave entrapment, but what they couldn't explain was the responsiveness of the patterns. Several of the most distinct phrases, like the sequence of knocks or the roll call loop, only began after seismic drilling resumed, almost like something had been triggered. And then there was the breath. In 3 separate recordings, once filtered and slowed, a sound emerged between the tapping intervals. It was not mechanical. It wasn't wind or vibration or equipment interference. It was the unmistakable inhalation of a human lung, ragged, slow, and terminally shallow. It lasted just under 2 seconds, followed by a crackling wheeze that broke off into silence. The forensic team couldn't replicate it artificially, nor could they find any environmental factor that would produce it naturally. The breath disturbed people more than the words, because it felt current, present, alive, and that, above all, was the most difficult part to reconcile. If these sounds were remnants, fossilized audio, how could breath still linger? And if they weren't, what exactly was beneath that sealed shaft? No one was willing to say definitively, not yet. The data wasn't complete, but behind closed doors, pressure was building. County officials, forensic specialists, and private contractors began meeting off-site to discuss the possibility of a controlled breach into the sealed corridor. Not to rescue anyone, but to understand, to find the source, to explain what decades of silence could no longer contain. Because if the dead really were speaking, someone had to be willing to listen. In early December 2023, as audio analysts continued dissecting the strange patterns recorded in the sealed shaft, another team, this one focused on historical documentation, began digging into a different kind of evidence: paper trails. The Carter Ridge Mine, like most operations of its size, had maintained decades of physical logs, maps, permits, and shift records, most of them boxed, yellowing, and stored in a disused file room at the now-abandoned regional office outside Scranton. Few had touched them since the mine's closure in late 1998. Most believed there was nothing left to find. But tucked between duplicate blueprint folders and faded supply manifests was a stack of internal memos marked "Internal Use Only," dated just 5 months before the collapse. The memos referenced a section of the mine labeled simply as D7. Nowhere in the official blueprints was a tunnel by that name recorded. But there it was, in shorthand notations and handwritten shift schedules, listed as active, with remarks like "West Wall reinforcement pending" and "Ventilation secondary access delayed." One memo, marked urgent, referred to "high-yield seam exposed in D7, advance ops requested before year-end." No geological survey had ever cleared that area. In fact, older records from the 1960s showed it was flagged as unstable and geologically unpredictable. Yet, in the months leading to the disaster, work orders tied to D-7 increased. A push was happening behind closed doors, and it wasn't sanctioned. Investigators cross-referenced these notations with recent GPR scans from the reopened site. The match was almost exact. The source of the seismic audio, the rhythmic knocking, the whispering voices, the inexplicable breath, all of it traced back to the same vector of rock that had once been labeled D7. What the radar showed now was a narrow lateral drift extending far beyond the official mine boundary. Longer, deeper, and worst of all, sealed. When news of the D7 discovery reached the original Carter Ridge survivors' families, some were stunned, others weren't surprised at all. Rumors about a forbidden tunnel had circled since the early days of the collapse, whispered by miners who'd seen things that never made the reports. A few even remembered hushed arguments near the emergency staging site in 1998, management figures speaking in tense tones, warning each other to keep that drift out of it. At the time, no one dared to ask what it meant. But now, people were talking. One of the original 1998 shift supervisors, who had long refused interviews, finally agreed to speak off record. His name was withheld, but his testimony was verified against shift logs and site reports. He claimed that in late summer of 1998, just weeks before the collapse, upper management had quietly ordered crews to resume work on Drift 7, despite safety red flags. The coal yield in that zone had tested high, a potential multi-million-dollar resource. According to him, the risk was known. The warnings were clear. But the payoff was deemed worth it. He also said something else, that on the morning of the collapse, he overheard a conversation between two senior engineers, one of whom had signed off on a controlled blast in D7 the night before. The blast wasn't in the records, it was never reported to the state. But it may have triggered the initial instability that brought down the tunnel. The implication was damning. This wasn't a random cave-in. It was a calculated operation gone wrong. And when it collapsed, 12 men were inside. Shortly after, a former explosives technician came forward, anonymously through legal counsel. He provided documentation showing that a classified detonation log had been purged from the September 2nd ledger. The only reason he kept a copy was because the blast had gone off nearly an hour late, and he was worried it would affect his pay. The coordinates listed in the deleted log? A direct match with the D7 drift line. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became. Carter Ridge executives had made a decision that day, one that would cost 12 lives and fracture an entire town. Whether the blast was meant to hide evidence of unauthorized drilling or simply meant to collapse a dangerous drift before regulators found out, no one knew, for sure. But the result was the same. Drift 7 was buried, and with it, whatever chance there might have been to save the men inside. Geological modeling confirmed that the drift ran within 50 feet of the current acoustic hotspot. In fact, the sealed corridor the entry team had reached, the one pulsing with unexplainable breath and half-spoken names, lined up exactly with the old D7 terminus. The sound wasn't coming from nowhere. It was coming from the very part of the mine no one was ever supposed to find again. Officials now faced a new reality. If the collapse had not been a natural event, if it had been hastened, or worse, orchestrated, then reopening the shaft was no longer just about closure. It was about accountability, and buried beneath the layers of stone, silence, and secrecy, something was still trying to speak. The forgotten drift had been found, and this time there was no way to seal it back up. On December 12th, after nearly 3 weeks of audio analysis, historical investigation, and behind-closed-door deliberations, drilling began. The plan was to bore horizontally into the suspected remains of Drift 7, approaching not from the original tunnel, but from a safer elevated angle through stable bedrock. It was the kind of operation typically reserved for salvage efforts or forensic recovery, but this was neither. No one knew exactly what they were breaking into. They just knew they had to get there. The site was restricted to essential personnel only. No media, no families. The noise from the machinery echoed for miles across the trees. By mid-morning, the rig had penetrated 40 feet into the slope, progressing at a careful pace. Ground stability sensors were embedded along the approach corridor, feeding real-time data to the surface. If pressure dropped too fast, if a fault line shifted even slightly, the whole drill would be called off. But for the first 24 hours, everything held. Then, on the second day, it happened. At 3:42 p.m., drill resistance dropped suddenly. A brief stutter in the motor. Then, a hollow break. The bit had punched through into something open. Immediately, a technician activated the suction vent to sample the interior air. What came out wasn't gas or moisture, but warm, dry air laced with particulates and the faint, unmistakable scent of old smoke. Not fresh, not sharp. Something aged, burned long ago. Mixed in was a low-pressure exhale, steady, sustained, like the release of lungs that had been holding their breath far too long. Before anyone could say it out loud, the tapping began again. Not faint, not buried in layers of static. This time, it came clearly through the drill shaft. 3 slow knocks, pause, 2 more, then silence, then again. Rescue personnel froze. Engineers stared at the seismic display. The rhythm wasn't seismic, it was deliberate. It mirrored the same distress code found in the earlier recordings. Only now it was louder, closer, like whatever was on the other side had heard them. A micro camera was threaded through the borehole. The line coiled slowly through the dark, descending into the breach. For the first few feet, the feed was stable, grainy but clear. The camera panned across a jagged corridor, roughly carved but unmistakably man-made. The walls were uneven, charred in some places, glinting with mineral deposits in others. Fragments of timber framing jutted out from the stone, collapsed and blackened as if burned from the inside. But what startled the team wasn't what they saw. It was what they didn't. No equipment, no tools, no helmets, no human remains, just footprints, dozens of them, pressed into the dust like they'd been left yesterday. Some walked in straight lines, others in circles. One pair led directly toward the far end of the corridor and stopped. That's where the feed began to distort. First, the lighting flickered, then the image split. By the time the camera reached 10 feet into the void, the signal was nearly unreadable. Pixels shuddering, static bleeding in along the edges. When they pulled the cable back, the distortion stopped. Video up to that point was preserved. Everything beyond, nothing. A second probe was deployed. Same result. Speculation began immediately. Electromagnetic interference, mineral interference, fault pressure. But the timing felt too intentional, almost like something didn't want to be seen. Meanwhile, structural monitors detected a slow shift in bedrock near the bore shaft. Nothing major, but enough to suggest the pocket they'd entered was unstable. Any full breach risked triggering another collapse. There were talks of halting the dig, filling the hole, sealing it back up. But one thing made that decision harder. The tapping hadn't stopped. Each time the drill paused, the rhythm returned, sometimes repeating the distress code, sometimes responding in bursts of 5 or 6 uneven knocks, like someone knocking on different surfaces or signaling across distance. Audio analysts recorded them all. One sequence even matched a pattern from the original 1998 rescue logs, an improvised code used by trapped miners during orientation drills to count survivors. No one could explain how that signal resurfaced now, 25 years later. But it was there, almost like a memory trying to be remembered. And then came the knock that no one expected. A single, slow strike, heavier than the rest. Not metal on stone, something softer, thicker. The kind of sound a human fist might make on wet wood. It echoed once and didn't return. The room fell quiet. There was no protocol for this, no section in the manual that covered hearing a sound like that from 600 feet below the surface. What they did know was that the rock was changing. The sensors showed widening fractures near the drift ceiling. The air temperature inside the void had risen 2 degrees in 12 hours. Pressure variance indicated subtle but constant expansion. The cavity wasn't just unstable, it was changing in real time. The team called in a temporary halt to drilling. Risk of collapse was now too high. Any further intrusion could collapse the corridor, burying whatever was left forever. But even as they sealed the bore shaft for the night, the knocking continued, faint but persistent, as if someone, or something, inside the drift hadn't yet realized it had already been left behind. The question no one could answer was simple. If this was just geology, just trapped sound, fractured memory, why was it responding now? On the morning of December 19th, a final decision was made. Despite the risks, a small crew would descend into the breached void beneath Carter Ridge. The entry would be controlled, time-limited, and supported by external monitors at every stage. They weren't going down to rescue anyone. Not anymore. They were going in to document, to see what was left, what had survived, and what hadn't. If the air held, they'd proceed. If not, they'd pull back. No second chances. The team consisted of 3, 2 subterranean rescue specialists and 1 structural geologist, outfitted with reinforced suits, respirators, thermal sensors, and tethered video relay. The passage was tight, jagged, and damp with condensation. The temperature fluctuated as they moved through, brief pockets of warmth followed by sudden unexplained cold. The walls looked burned in places, blackened and glazed, like stone exposed to intense heat decades ago. Still, the corridor held. Just beyond the point where the last micro-camera feed had failed, the path opened into a larger chamber, oval-shaped, roughly 20 feet across, with ceiling supports partially collapsed, and scattered across the floor were signs of life. Not recent, but unmistakable. Miner helmets, 6 of them, lined the right wall, some upright, others toppled, a rusted thermos, a pair of gloves still folded like someone had placed them there and never returned. Shovels and handpicks lay arranged in what looked like a pile, almost too neat for a panic scenario. And sitting near the center of the chamber was a lantern, old, dented with a cracked glass casing and a low, flickering flame inside. The flame was still burning. One of the rescuers stepped forward, thinking it was a trick of the headlamp, but the flame didn't react to light. It flickered independently. Oxygen meters showed adequate levels, and the fuel chamber, when checked, was 3/4 full. Impossible. That model hadn't been manufactured since the early 90s. Lantern oil degrades, yet the flame was steady, faint, but alive, like it had been lit that same morning. Then came the clothing. Scattered across the chamber's far side were shirts, jackets, a pair of denim work pants. No blood, no signs of struggle. Just items laid down in layers as if removed by choice. Boot prints, partially preserved in the dry dust, led from the center of the room toward the far end of the drift, where a rockfall had sealed the tunnel completely. Not a single footprint returned. It was a one-way path. And then the knocking stopped. After weeks of relentless tapping, shifting rhythms, Morse-like signals, and breath that didn't belong, the space fell utterly silent. No interference, no pulses. The seismic reader, which had been logging activity since the first borehole breach, went flat. The team paused, exchanging a silent look through their visors. One of them, a man named Lane, spoke quietly into his mic. Just a whisper. "Is anyone here?" That's when it changed. The temperature plummeted, a 10-degree drop in under 30 seconds. The air thickened, dense with particles invisible to the eye but present on the scanner. Then, clear as if standing inches behind him, Lane heard a voice. Male. Low. Just one sentence. "It's too late now." He spun. No one was behind him. The other 2 team members had heard nothing. The external mics picked up only static. Lane's vitals spiked. Heart rate, breathing, cortisol. His mask fogged. He staggered back toward the main entry path and radioed for immediate withdrawal. The team followed without resistance. As they retreated, one of the support cameras panned once more over the central chamber. The lantern still flickered. The boot still pointed toward the sealed wall. And behind it, behind the layers of stone and time and silence, there was only a void. The team emerged 30 minutes later, shaken but physically unharmed. The equipment was reviewed, the footage confirmed. Everything they had seen, they had captured. Except the voice. Lane's helmet mic recorded only a faint burst of static, followed by his reply. But his reaction, caught on biometric telemetry, was real. He hadn't imagined it. Something had spoken to him. Alone. Later that evening, the lead geologist reviewed the structural scan of the sealed end of the chamber. The blockage was old, yes, but not natural. Unlike the rockfall above, this one was layered, packed with consistency. The debris bore signs of intentional collapse. Someone, decades ago, had closed that section from the inside. Buried it. Theories emerged. Some believed the miners, after the collapse, had found their way to the old drift, only to discover it led nowhere. Others wondered if they'd been trying to prevent something from escaping. One suggestion, circulated quietly among investigators, was that the men had survived longer than reported, that they'd maintained fire, rationed oxygen, and waited until waiting no longer made sense, and that in their final moments they'd sealed themselves in, not to hide, but to contain whatever had begun inside that drift. but no one could say for certain. There were no bodies, no time-stamped notes, just voices that came and went, a flame that shouldn't burn, and footprints leading deeper than anyone dared to go. The shaft was resealed the next day, permanently this time. Not because the mystery was solved, but because what had been found didn't want to be disturbed again. It took nearly 2 months to get a conclusive answer. After the chamber was sealed, teams from 3 separate geological institutes were brought in to conduct a full survey of the surrounding strata. Their goal wasn't just to map the tunnel, but to understand why, for the first time in recorded history, a mine that had been silent for a quarter of a century had begun to speak. What they found buried beneath Carter Ridge had nothing to do with ghosts or folklore, but it was no less haunting. The scans revealed a narrow seam of quartz crystal running horizontally through the rock, stretching across what had once been the D7 corridor. Not rare in and of itself. Quartz is common in coal country, but this seam was different. Dense, compacted under layers of metamorphic pressure for thousands of years, the structure had formed a naturally resonant pocket, an acoustic cavity so specific in shape and mineral content that it behaved like a chambered echo device. Sound, once introduced into that space, didn't simply fade. It lingered. It bounced. It stored itself in the cracks of the crystal matrix like dust trapped in glass. Under ideal conditions, scientists explained, acoustic energy could become refracted and preserved, not in a literal recording, but as a series of vibrational patterns held within the stone. These patterns could remain dormant for years, even decades, until changes in temperature, pressure, or mechanical interference, like seismic drilling, disrupted the crystal enough to release them. That, the team concluded, was what had happened. When the miners cried out in the darkness, when they tapped messages into the walls, when they whispered names to steady themselves, those vibrations didn't vanish. They sank into the quartz. They stayed there. And for 25 years, they waited. Until the recent excavation fractured just enough of the crystal pocket to begin letting the past bleed through. The voice fragments, the roll calls, the breath, not ghosts, not living survivors, but echoes, acoustic ghosts, a rare, barely understood geological event that science had only recently begun to explore. Not paranormal, yet profoundly human. The revelation brought with it a new kind of silence in Grafton, not the empty, heavy quiet that had followed the collapse, but something closer to peace. For the first time, the families knew the truth. The 12 men had not survived long, likely not more than 5 or 6 days beyond the collapse. They had found the old drift, lit their lanterns, rationed what they had, and tried to reach someone. They had called for help until their voices gave out, and then the mine held their final moments, trapped not in memory, but in stone. In mid-January, state officials, family members, and representatives from the geological teams gathered at the edge of the Carter Ridge site one final time. A brief ceremony was held. No press. Just 37 people standing in the snow, listening as a plaque was lowered into place. The memorial was simple. Bronze on dark stone, bolted into the earth just outside the sealed entrance. It read, "They called, and we finally heard." There were no speeches, no cameras, just the families, the wind, and the fence. Some touched the stone, others left small offerings, hard hats, name tags, a photo in a rusted frame. A few wept, not for the first time, but maybe for the last. The site was officially designated closed that same week, permanently, not for danger, but for sanctity. No more drilling, no further study. The crystal seam would remain undisturbed, its strange echo chamber intact, a time capsule not of voices, but of human effort, of fear, hope, and endurance trapped in the walls of the earth. The recordings were archived with full analysis and sealed copies given to each of the 12 families. They weren't easy to listen to. They weren't polished or complete, just pieces. Tap sequences, stammered names, the soft rasp of someone trying to breathe in darkness. But they were real. And for many, that made them sacred. Even skeptics admitted there was something deeply unsettling about hearing the exact same knock pattern. 3, pause, II, repeating 25 years after it had first been taught in safety drills, a message sent by dying men never received in time until now. To this day, the Carter Ridge collapse remains the only known case where naturally preserved acoustic data, unintentional, undocumented, and undirected, was released through fractured mineral. No other mine has produced anything similar. Scientists believe the circumstances were uniquely aligned. One event, one seam, one moment in time where the elements conspired to hold a message no one was ever meant to hear. But they did hear it, eventually. The story spread quietly beyond the town, not in headlines, but in corners of the internet where people talked about lost things. It became the subject of podcasts, message boards, speculative articles. Some said it proved that the past always leaves a trace. Others simply saw it as the final breath of 12 lives that deserved to be remembered. And in Grafton, the mine faded back into silence. But not the same kind of silence, not the kind that comes from being forgotten. This time, it was a silence that said, "We heard them, and we didn't walk away."